Again. Okay, now I'm going to get started. Well, I want to welcome you all to our third conversation, our series on grandparenting today. We hope that you and your families are well. 175 folks have signed up for this conference, for this call. And it's part of a remarkable response we've received from this three-part series. We'd like your help. Given the popularity of these series, we're going to be sending out a questionnaire survey at the end of the series. And we'd love your help in identifying what was valuable, what was not valuable, what you'd like to see. And additionally, please feel free to email us at info@jewishgrandparentsnetwork.org with ideas about different programs that would be of value to you. Now, by and large, we have folks from across America, but I think we have at least one person from Israel on the phone, not more. I just happen to see Rabbi Neil Kirsten, who I want to send a special regards to. Neil is a wonderful educator, and we want to send our greetings. Just some housekeeping. Everybody should be muted. I know that's difficult for a group of grandparent Jews, but we'll do our best. We're trying to avoid the sounds of multiple dogs barking and bells ringing and cats screeching. You should all be in gallery mode, which would mean that whoever is speaking will be in the main screen. If not, you'll be in the mode where everybody will seem like it's a multi-dimensional tic-tac-toe box. What was it called? Hollywood Squares box. We hope you'll ask questions of our panelists. We're going to talk for about 15, 20 minutes, maybe a half hour. And then we're going to open up the floor for questions anytime along the way. If you have questions, please post them in the chat box. If you don't see your chat box, you could click on the bottom where it says chat, and that will open it up. When you write a question, my associate, Sarah Reed, will note it, and we'll get back to it when the time comes for questions and answers. Okay. Before we introduce the speakers, I want to send a minute to introduce my colleague, friend, and extraordinary Jewish community leader, and maybe the best grandparent I've ever met, and that's Liam Hendler, who is the co-founder of the Jewish Grandparents Network and the president. Lee, could you just wave hello so we could all see you and say hello? Lee is going to say a couple words at the end, just to give her own perspective and perhaps share some upcoming Jewish Grandparent Network activities. So one of the great joys of my life is meeting really remarkable people, and today we're just delighted to have three very remarkable people who are all leaders in their field and perhaps of greater importance, all grandparents. And we're going to be discussing the challenges of grandparenting during times of challenging, that is to say, both the challenges and opportunities of grandparenting in times of challenging, focus on, of course, the COVID crisis. Our panelist for today is my fellow Atlantan, Marshall Duke, who is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of Psychology at Emory University and a core faculty member of the Emory Center for the Study of Myth in Ritual and American Life. He's the author of numerous books. Marshall asked me to remind everybody that here in Atlanta, we're expecting significant rainstorms, which means that any time it storms is a very good possibility that we'll lose our internet. If we do, Renee was going to take over, and we will get back on phone. We're calling in. Speaking of Renee, Renee Cherow-O'Leary is President of Education for the 21st Century, a media consulting group in New York City and Los Angeles that develops curriculum and educational materials for multiple platforms and conducts quantitative research for educational organizations. I seem to remember you spent many years consulting for Sesame Street, which makes you holy in all of our eyes.
Thank you.
And finally, a dear friend, Esther Netter, who is the founder and chief executive officer of Sharewell, the home of Caton's Children's Museum and Youth Think. Caton's Children's Museum, I believe, is the first major children's museum in Los Angeles, which was founded within the Federation Building in Los Angeles. So with that, I'm going to ask a question for Marshall and Hedda and Esther. What has it been like for you as grandparents during the COVID crisis? And whoever likes to speak first should do so. Hedda, you're on the screen. Why don't you talk first? I'm sorry, not Hedda. I mean, Renee. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Renee. Sorry.
Thank you, David. That's all right. Hedda and I are related by Mr. Rogers.
You're right.
It's been, I think I would say, emotionally difficult time because there is just, in the beginning, the real fear of health. And New York City, where I live, has been the epicenter, although it's much better now. And the issues as a grandparent were that our children, who do also live in New York City, decided to sequester upstate. And we have other grandchildren who live in Los Angeles with a new baby there, and we haven't seen that baby since January. So FaceTime and all of the other technologies do not really change that desire for connection. Nevertheless, we're healthy, we're strong, we're doing our best to stay connected to friends and family and grandchildren.
Great. Now, Marshall, you had a little bit of a, virtual simcha. Could you kind of share your experience as a grandfather during the COVID crisis? Marshall? I think Marshall sometimes mutes his dog because he has his phone because he has a dog.
Marshall, you're muted.
Okay.
There you go.
I say again, hello, everybody. I hope that everybody is safe and well and your families are doing all right. We are all experiencing a similar kind of thing, and that is that we've got grandchildren out there, some far away, some close by. Our closest grandchildren are 7 minutes drive from where I live. May as well be 700 miles from where we are because we don't get to see them so easily. We're all experiencing this frustration of wanting to maintain or even increase the connections that we've got with these kids. And it's increasingly difficult because they see us as maybe somebody that they need to take care of, which is really an interesting shift for them. It's not like don't go to grandma and grandpa because they might get you sick. It's the opposite. Just don't go by them because you might get them sick, and it gives them a really odd perspective on what this relationship is all about. So we're all in places where we're kind of with trepidation, wondering how we can move a little bit more close to them. As David mentioned, we had an online bat mitzvah. My granddaughter's bat mitzvah was early April, and it was completely online. Everybody was at their houses. The rabbis were at their house. My son and his family and the bat mitzvah girl were at their houses, and there they were on the screen, just like it's on the screen now. Oddly, it worked out all right. She was able to do her Torah portion on her speech, and we were able to celebrate with her. And as my son said, the kiddush afterwards was less expensive than he had anticipated. So, but we're finding new ways of doing things. We've had driveway visits. I know that Esther's had a drive-by visit, right? So we're trying to find ways to see them, but we can't really get closer than that. And I think that's something that we really have to wrestle with. So that's just the beginning to some of the differences that I'm experiencing, but I'll pass it on to Esther.
Esther.
It's good to see everybody, and thank you for joining us and giving us the opportunity to share some of our stories and learn from you. The drive-by visit that Marshall's referencing, I've got 2 sets of grandchildren, ones that are in LA with me, and the other is up north where I am right now. There's a twist to my story. We were doing drive-bys laden with Amazon goodies to visit my LA grandkids, 4 and 2. And it actually was kind of hard because the kids instinctively ran from the stoop at the front door to us. We were standing at the car. My son instinctively, kind of screamed, don't, you can't go to Safta. You can't go there. And the kids kind of spun around wondering why their father just yelled at them when they were just doing what came instinctively. I instantly shuddered at the thought that my grandchildren just got yelled at for trying to come and hug me. But when I unpacked it later with my son and daughter-in-law, really understanding that hesitation and the distance comes from a place of love and fear and care, that they don't want the kids to get us sick, as we all know. I just don't feel vulnerable in that way. So it was hard for me to accept that. But we've figured it out and are finding ways to communicate. I am now up north in San Francisco because a month ago got a call from my daughter who thought she was going into premature labor with her third. And when you think that is happening 2.5 months too soon, your worries about COVID and distance go out the door. And I jumped in my car and drove up north, and instantly became now quarantined with my daughter. She is, thank God, still pregnant and due any day now, so thank goodness. But I've witnessed, when I showed up at my daughter's house to see the 5-year-old and 3-year-old who really were the people who kept me driving and not stopping to go to the bathroom, was I knew I was going to be seeing them. When I got to their front door, they turned to their parents and said, "Are we allowed to hug Safta now that she's here?" And my daughter said, "Yes, she's joining our Corona family." And then, as if no time was lost, I hadn't seen them in 2 months. We literally just picked up from where we were before, which I think we also know, but we forget how resilient children are, and how kind of love and touch and proximity, they're like sleep. It's hard to bank it, but once you get it, you're right back to where you need to be. So literally within a moment, all of that distance and challenge and existing only on FaceTime and Zoom literally washed away. So I'm still up north and am Zooming now with my boyfriend, who's crankier than any of the grandkids have been in this process, but that's another Zoom call for anyone who wants to do the grown-up version. But I am very fueled by, I just feel like the forgiveness and acceptance of these 2 grandchildren who, were experiencing the same ban that we are experiencing, but literally on a dime, they pivoted to what is normal. So anyway, that's where I'm at with my 2 sets. Okay, David, back to you.
Well, I actually do want to follow up with the question was in the list of questions, so I apologize for that. But you said a couple of things, Esther, that I find intriguing, and each of our panelists, I think, are really, in terms of their professional background, can respond to. This notion of, are we allowed to hug Safta? Are we allowed to hug our grandparents? This notion of an approach avoidance. Well, can I go approach her? So these barriers that have been created in terms of the relationship between the grandparents and the grandkids, there's this book we love by Jane Isay called Unconditional Love, which talks about that relationship. Well, maybe it's not so unconditional these days. And so the question is, you know, what do you see as the kind of the longer term impacts in terms of this kind of, you know, are you part of my Corona family, or maybe you're not part of my Corona family? Can I hug Savta? Can I not hug Savta? Or I just haven't seen you in 6 months. I don't, Marsha, Renee?
Well, so let me chime in here. This is unprecedented. We have not in our lifetimes known anything like this, but there may be things similar to it that we might be able to look to. And that is what happens to really deep relationships when people are separated for some reason. It might be because of military service. It may be because of other reasons, business, couples living in different cities. So we do know something about relationships that are strong and do experience separation. And the story that Esther tells is a very common one. It's not uncommon for people to say, for example, well, we didn't see each other for 5 years, but we picked up where we were. And we just sort of go on. It's as if nothing ever happened, the conversation continued. And I think that's something that is very real. And I think that's something that probably we'll see happen with many of the grandchildren. And then I think the ones that we were close to and schmoozed with and were very tight with, we will be again, is my guess. And the ones that were a little bit off from us, that were a little bit more challenging for us, I think they'll still be that way. I think what will happen is that we'll just bounce back into the place where we were. The situation right now is so strong that it overrides individual differences. And I think that's one of the things we're looking at from a psychological point of view is that, you know, in any situation, any moment in our lives, sometimes it's our individual differences that determine how we behave, or it's a situation that determines how we behave. And there's usually a balance of those two. But what we have now is a situation that is so strong that it's causing us all to act in the same way, which is very, very unusual. Except in North Georgia where nobody's wearing masks. But that's it. So, but I think that basing the future, again, it's unknown. As somebody wrote in the New York Times on Sunday in an editorial, says, nobody knows what's going to happen. And I think that that's probably the safest position to take, is that nobody knows what's going to happen. We can guess, we can hope that the future will be similar to the past. And that's what we've got to go on.
Can I add to that
Please,
a little bit?
please.
I agree entirely with what Marshall said. I think it depends on the age of the grandchild, for one, and also their need to understand the context here. We have an 8-year-old who lives in New York, the ones that have gone upstate, and he's interested in science. And, you know, the question of a virus coming and changing the entire dynamic while he's not researching this, I think his parents have tried very much to explain what this is about. Not just that you can't hug us, you know, just because, but because there are consequences and it works in a certain way. I fear that our grandchildren, the little ones, we also have a baby and a 4-year-old. The little ones, I'm not sure what they're exactly understanding. They just are very closely held in a way. But I think when this is over, it will be a marker event, maybe like the polio situation in my youth. And I remember that well, and situations like that. So I think for our grandkids, we cannot protect them from that. They happen to be born in the middle of this worldwide issue. And so history is a part of what's happening here.
Esther, I wanted to give you a question to follow up on this a little bit. When we first spoke about your drive-by grandparenting, which I thought was such a powerful, powerful story, And you also spoke about our feeling vulnerable. I mean, we're just really feeling vulnerable. And I wonder about how do we balance this need, how do we balance the role of grandparents in being able to show vulnerability, yet at the same time be able to say, well, you know, it will be okay. I mean, you know, we don't want our grandkids to see us, you know, crying hysterically on the floor. Yet on the other hand, like, there is something, I would think, of value in our grandkids knowing that we are vulnerable. Esther, would you want to respond to that, or?
Yeah, I think we're all, you know, learning how to take on these roles. The same way that when we first become grandparents, we are not practiced. We may have memories of being grandparented if we were blessed enough to grow up with grandparents. But we learn that role just like we learn how to be, you know, a mother-in-law, or how to be a spouse, or how to be a parent for the first time. So I think as people, life hands us these first-time experiences, and we can draw on what we know about being in that first-time space. It's this vulnerability acknowledgement. And by the way, I'm still fighting it. I'm about to be 62, so I clearly hear that 3 distinction before 65 as not including me. But in accepting my kids' concern, my grown-up children's concern for me, I'm accepting their love and their care and their good intention. And that's a beautiful thing, because I can't hug my kids, you know, all my kids now either. And I, you know, in the face of not knowing this and how it's revealing itself every day, you know, I ask myself every day if I'm doing my best, and that's all I can expect from myself. And so it means asking myself as a parent, you know, am I doing my best? And as a grandparent, and in the grandparent role, it is holding on to being that space of unconditional love. In that parent role for my adult children, it's giving them a whole lot more space, and my being quieter, because they need to say things, share things, determine things, make their own structures and rules for their own family. And I have no more experience with a pandemic than they do. So in a way, it's equalizing. And with the grandchildren, it's trying to carve out, you know, unique interactions. I don't think the kids, the little ones, I've got little ones, I don't think they're going to remember specifics, but I absolutely do think the 4-year-olds and up are going to remember in aggregate this era, this moment. Mm-hmm. So I'm, you know, using my phone to document it, screenshots, take pictures. I have the grandkids email me art they're making. I print it on my printer and I tape it all over my condo. So that they see we have a COVID, or every kid's got a COVID art gallery. And I'm like, I would do that if they brought me the painting they made on Mother's Day. So I'm trying to find ways to make this time, you know, normal, and accepting that the older generation is viewed as vulnerable and families need to take extra care of us is part of this new reality, and I'm fighting a bit, but I'm accepting my vulnerability, which is accepting my kids' love.
Great. We said a couple of times, we really don't know what the future is going to bring, but we do know about the past. And we do know about past crises that people have been through, that we've been through, that our parents have been through, that our grandparents have been through. So I thought this might be a good time for Marshall to talk a little bit about your research on the importance of family narratives, and specifically how that is important in terms of what's happening today.
Okay, yeah, and we have a limited amount of time, so I'm going to try and condense the research into just a couple of brief comments. One is that kids benefit from knowing the history of their families. Kids are made stronger by knowing what happened to their parents, what happened to their grandparents, what happened to their great-grandparents. In other words, they benefit from having stories about the past transmitted to them so that they can make connections to the family which lived long before they even were on this earth. So we call this something called the intergenerational self, which is a notion that I really belong to a longer lived family than I have been part of for my 8 or 10 years. I go back to my parents, I go back to my grandparents. Things that happened to them happened to me as well. And I can learn from their experiences how our family deals with situations like this. So the research basically showed that knowledge of family history is associated with better levels of adjustment, with higher levels of resilience, and so forth. Meaning that the old idea of the Baba Maisa that many of you know about, Baba Maisa being usually something negative, you know, oh, it's a Baba Maisa. It's not a real story. It's not true. Well, it turns out that family stories are not true, but it's another part of it. But I had a wonderful woman come up to me in New York when I gave a talk there, and she says, "You're not talking about Baba Mises. You're talking about Mises van de Bubby. You're talking about stories that Grandma tells us, and that's different from a Baba Misa. It's a real story, and it's something that happened and is remembered as having happened with all the errors in memory that are common." It's important from the perspective of us as grandparents to try and tell the stories to the kids as much as possible. And most parents will find times to tell these stories. Well, what's becoming even more important now, I think, is not just the stories that we tell, but the stories that we behave, the stories that we demonstrate through how we're acting in this situation. In other words, yeah, we're upset about this. We're worried about this. But we're also demonstrating through our behavior that we've been through this before, and we don't know how it's going to come out, but we do know that it won't stay the same. And that's what comes with age, is that we know that everything changes. Sometimes it gets worse, but over time, it resolves itself. And so if we think back to the other times in history that horrible things have happened, somehow over time we rise above them, we come through. And I think that our behavior is really the loudest voice that the kids can hear now as they look and see how we're responding. We're learning Zoom, you know, we're going online, we're doing FaceTime. We're adapting, and it's not necessary for us to say, watch us adapt. The kids are watching, and they're cueing off us, just as Esther's grandchildren looked at their mom before they ran up to Esther to hug her. That, right in the nutshell, is the whole of what we as grandparents, I think, have the power to do, and that is to be looked at and watched. How are they acting? And that's what teaches the kids how to respond. If we're panicking, if we're demonstrating the belief that you know, all is lost, the kids are going to feel that. But if we're kind of dealing with it, I think we're teaching them a very powerful lesson. That in addition with telling stories. You know, we've been through this before. Renee talked about the polio epidemic. We remember, those of us old enough to remember, not going to the swimming pool in the summer.
Absolutely.
No camp, nothing, Don't go near that area. Don't be with these kids. Well, we did that. Okay, and we all remember economic downturns, and we remember other diseases that came and went. And so we bring that wisdom with us to them, and the stories about that are the things that reassure them. So I think bottom line is that we want to tell them the stories. We have more time than ever. We can write them the stories. We can go online with them and chat about them. Sometimes they'll want to hear them. Sometimes they won't want to hear them. Doesn't matter to me. We have to tell them anyway, because we've got time, you know. So the words that we say, the behaviors that we manifest, and also their own imagination is what contributes to the stories that they know about the families. What do they imagine we were like when we were kids? What do they imagine their grandparents were like? Those things help them to create a story, and we know that they all do this. They fill in the blanks, and they don't get the stories in a sequential, carefully composed fashion. They get bits and pieces, and it's their job to put the pieces together, and they do. And if there's a missing piece, they'll make it up, and they'll put it in, and they'll all have a story. The most important word for the stories, as I've found recently, just in the past 2 years, is ownership. That is, the kids need to feel that they own the family story. It belongs to them. We've given it to them, and they carry it with them, and we assume and hope that they'll transmit it onward someday in the future.
Well, it sounds like, you know, it's not only important that they know the family story, but I wonder how important it is that they know that they're participating in making the family story, or they're creating the family story anew. And so I just wonder, go ahead, Renee.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. I wanted to add to what Marshall said about intergenerational storytelling. I can remember my grandparents talking about their grandparents when the Cossacks came in Russia, and hid behind I always remember this story, and again, it's only in my imagination, of course, that my grandmother's grandmother hid behind a stove to keep warm and hide away, you know, and that's a real story in my head. But I wanted to also say something about us professionally as well as personally, grandparents. I was saying in a conversation we all had the other day, I teach in a university, and my students are undergrads, mostly like 19 and 20 years old. And I felt very grandmotherly toward them, particularly as we moved online to finish the semester. And part of that was really like being this voice, as Marshall is explaining, of it's okay. We've been through things, maybe not this, but we have been through traumatic experiences, whether it's World War II, you know, things that they know about and have heard about. And so I felt myself becoming grandparently, I hope subtly, to my students. And I felt like I became a teacher to my grandchild. It was a very strange reversal of roles, but a sort of sense of that the students needed that kind of unconditional love more than ever. And of course, in a regular classroom, that might be harder to manifest. My colleague and I had 50 students this term. But alongside with the chat of in our Zoom classrooms, there was a great deal of emotional outpouring. And I felt like I I became a sort of intergenerational grandparent to not only my own grandchildren.
Well, I want to unwrap that a minute. I just want to remind people, if you have comments or questions, please post them. Just to note, there's a note from Jody Rubin who said, I had the blessing of living in a multi-generational household. I think my kids and grandkids are missing out on that close connection to grandparents. We have lots of time to share stories. So I think what Jody's in fact saying is that we may be far apart, but we do have the blessing of having additional time to engage in those, to share those stories. So Renee and Marcia, you're both faculty, and Esther, you're executive director of a major organization who oversees a number of staff. I just want to dig in a little bit more to what does that mean to be grandparental beyond, being grandparenting? It's just not a matter of not taking your students out for ice cream. Is it a matter of having them letting them be greater access to their feelings? I mean, would you help me unwrap that a little bit if we can?
Maybe I'll just, since I mentioned, I'll follow up. I feel it's partly a values orientation, not something so consciously worked out, but it's a way of respecting our common experience. So since none of us knows what's happening in this pandemic, in a way, we're all reduced to a sort of level of unknowing. I think it is a compassion. Some of my students' parents had COVID. They had to go back home to a much less comfortable situation than being in the dorm, let's say, and they had to find themselves amidst a lot of family issues. So they needed someone to talk to, but subtly. I did get an email from someone at 4 o'clock in the morning who was in an abusive situation. And I had one student who I had no idea was suicidal. And believe me, these were like outpourings of having to be calm, being parental and grandparental, being calm, responding immediately, assessing the situation, trying to figure out who might help and how. So in that sense, and one other thing really fast, there is a group called the Indigenous Grandmothers. I don't know how many people have heard of them. I came upon them some time ago, and they're mostly from Central and South America. And they are like the grandmothers who are trying to save the world. They kind of come from backgrounds of shamanism and other things, which is a story for another day. But I do think as grandparents, they take this role on of healing. And so there's some way, I think, that there's a healing component that we have because of our long history that might affect everyone who we know.
Marshall or Esther, do you want to follow up on that in any way? Or?
Yeah, I just think that, in all of our roles, there's this sameness. When interactions all look like this. So this screen of all these faces and boxes with red microphones or no microphones. This is what a Shiva looks like. This is what a staff meeting looks like. This is what a family birthday celebration looks like. If you're in therapy, there's one face there. This is what therapy looks like. That there's also this shared sameness of feelings. So we were talking before of vulnerabilities. We were talking about shared stories. We're talking about not knowing. I think that, before this happened, we might have been one version of ourselves in a professional context another version of ourselves in a personal context, and an even different version of ourselves in a family context or as a grandparent, and probably a little tweaked or nuanced depending on which family or grandkids or kids we're dealing with. I find myself being more the same in all my different roles in this pandemic. That, you know, the first week, even how, I won't speak for everybody on this call, but even how I showed up to meetings, how I dressed, or if I put on jewelry or makeup, or my first board meeting on Zoom, I put on a silk shirt and a jacket and was like, this is ridiculous. So I am more of who I am and similar in all my different roles. So if I'm telling more stories in professional contexts than I used to, and I am, you know, more honest across the board. So I'm curious how bifurcated that will be in a return to new normal. I just wonder, even Renee and Marshall, or all of us who have these different roles in our lives, now that you've had and shared intimate space and conversation with students, how does a return to classroom change that?
Mm-hmm.
And we've now been able to see each other's homes. We've shown up a little unvarnished in these Zoom meetings. And even with our families and grandkids, there's a different kind of exposure. So while it's not the same as being in person, in a way, it's extraordinarily intimate. We are staring into each other's eyes for going on an hour now with all of you. So, you know, I venture to say that if any of you kind of new relationships reached out to me and said, I was on the Jewish Grandparents Network call when you, Renee, and Marshall were speaking, I will note that. Our relationship has begun, even though I've never met you. So to me, there is richness in this moment. There are learnings in this moment. And anyway, so, and I will just tell you, in my professional world, being a grandparent and parent, I've made a very difficult decision. But the not knowing was too much to bear for my staff and for myself. And so our museum is not going to open before January, and middle of October, we will be reevaluating whether we can open up safely for my staff and our visitors. And if it has to be pushed another 6 months, so be it. So that was more parental than grandparent, but yeah.
But I think you said something, Marshall, did you want to, because we have
before Esther says something which I want to follow up on, that is that, you know, when we become grandparents, the only difference between what was before and what was after is that we're being called grandparent. We don't, just because we're called something doesn't mean we are that. We were called mom and dad biologically well before we were psychologically or emotionally parents. So right now we are grandparents, and just as we change from the grandparent of 1 to the grandparent of 2 to the grandparent of 3, and how it requires us to adjust, this is now an addition to what it's like to be a grandparent of X number of grandchildren in this COVID situation. And again, we need to learn a new way of being grandparents. I think there's some opportunities here. I think, was it Jody wrote about not being close enough to the kids to be able to tell all the stories that she heard when she was younger. And I think this opportunity gives us I think it gives us justification, rationale to write out what we want to tell the grandchildren. We are vulnerable, and if we were vulnerable in another kind of situation, we might say, I want to get everything down that I want to tell these kids. And I think that if we feel up to it and wish to, we should write to the grandchildren. We should write down what we want to tell them. We should gather together whatever things we want to be sure that they know we have, or to give them things, although our children don't want any of our things. Grandchildren might. I see by the reaction that we're familiar with that. But I think that what we want to do is we want them to hear the stories, and we want them to like hearing the stories. And I think those need to be separated. I think what we need to do is exercise wisdom and say, I know that somewhere down the line, you're going to want to have this wisdom that I'm going to transmit to you. And I'm going to write it in my own hand, not as an email. I'm going to write it out on a piece of paper or in a book, and I'm going to give it to you. And you might say, oh, Grandma, Grandpa, I don't want any of this kind of stuff, but they will not throw it away. It's in your handwriting. It's from you directly. And at some point in their lives, even now, because they've got time as well, they might just read it. But if not, they'll read it later. And there will be a document of what went on right now and how you perceived it and how you dealt with it. So I think that we need to do is become more active as grandparents in these times, and to do the things, even if our daughter-in-laws don't want us to, or our sons-in-laws may be uncomfortable with that. I think we kind of say, hey, listen, we're taking the risk here. We're the ones who are vulnerable. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to give you this. And these are the stories that I think are important for you to know. To put them in place, because that's the opportunity we have now. Most of the time, we receive stories like Renee's got this incredibly wonderful story about great-great-grandparent doing something heroic. Well, we're going to document the heroism of how we all lived through this time, and how they lived through this time, and how we saw them live through it, and just do it. I find, and many of the people I've talked to, the grandparents, find that, you know, if you wait for permission, it's not likely to come. But wisdom is what we have with age and experience. And wisdom says, you know, I think you're going to need this. So I'm going to give it to you. And then later on, you'll realize that I was right. But if we don't do it, I think we'll feel bad about it. And someday they'll say to themselves, yeah, I wish I knew what happened or what they had felt during these times. So one of the things I think we're recommending from a narrative, a family story point of view, is that as grandparents, Jewish grandparents, in this time, we need to just take some time, sit down and create a document or some kind of record to give to them. And I hope that we'll all have a chance to read it with them, but if not, just know that it's there.
So we have about, it's about 13 to 3. We may go a little longer. I hope that's okay, because we have some really, I think, important questions to get to. I'm going to ask, Lee asked a really good question. I'm going to ask her to say hello, and I'm going to unmute you, Lee. And so you could ask your question directly and say hello.
On those individuals and organizations.
Now I'm unmuted. Okay,
Yeah.
so I'm not sure which question that was. I will ask a slightly different one. Well, it's are we elders? Do we embrace or reject the idea of grandparent as elder? It comes from the listening to all that you all are sharing, and Esther's notion that she has more fully integrated the multiple roles that she plays in her life. And Renee, your story as well as a professional, the work that you did, which was grandparental. And at this moment, does this call upon us to step beyond the role of grandparent and see ourselves perhaps in an even broader context?
Well,
One person commented that it was yes and no, it was a mixed blessing because it contains the tension of time, which is my daughter calls it before Corona, after Corona, BC, AC, and DC. And DC, time is kind of this suspension of reality, the reality that we knew before and the reality that we will have afterwards, and this sense that we are inventing the rules as we go, but that we don't know how long that time is going to go. And grandparents, the blessing of grandparents, I think the immediacy, the sense of urgency about our relationships and the poignancy of them is that we do finally accept that our lives are limited. We are not going to live forever. And this has heightened, the coronavirus reality has heightened that all the more so. So I'll throw that in to further complicate things.
It just seems to me that, you know, the term grandparent to a certain extent, or grandparental, has become increasingly synonymous with elderly or elders. We live in a society, Lee and I talk about this a lot, where respect for authority has really diminished dramatically. But at the same time, I think we're hearing is that, certainly from all of our panelists in their roles as professionals, that as grandparents, they have become kind of respected elders who have an important voice to be heard and a valuable person to talk with. I don't know if folks want to respond to that, but there's some really good questions that I want to ask as well. So I don't know, anybody want to add to that before we ask the questions?
I just want to say that I don't think elder is a derogatory term. It could be, it may be, but I think that particular phrase or you know, concept of elder is in the societies where elders are respected and where they are honored, etc. And the idea, the indigenous grandmothers that I mentioned before, are seen as the elder wise women of the community, you know, whose wisdom connects in some cosmic way. So while we don't want to go too far maybe in that direction, it's a much longer conversation. I do think that the eldering, I think there's a new book out called Eldering. And Zalman Schachter-Shalomi, who's written some wonderful work on aging and saging, he also has that concept of the elder. So it's not very recognized, I think, in our society, but I do think amongst people of, I'll say, for generically our age, who's ever on the call, we're beginning to see that there is this more powerful role of sage and eldering as a possibility.
I'm going to switch the conversation because there's a couple of very interesting questions. So we talked a lot about being grandparents to kids 3 years and above, 4 years and above, bar bat mitzvah, but some of us are grandparents to new children, to infants. So Laurie asks, what about the infants? Is a 6-month-old making any connection to us on a tiny phone screen, even if daily? It's very hard. And she also asks, please address the suffering, the other side of that dynamic, the suffering of a new grandparent or new grandparents without long-standing connections, but craving it. We thought this was the beginning of a wonderful new phase of life, but now it's all gone. The sense as a new these months are so precious and they're being taken away from us. So those are kind of two different questions. What about the children and what about us? Those of us who have, you know, new grandchildren.
I have some friends who became grandparents for the first time a month and a half ago. They're in Atlanta. The grandchild is in Washington, D.C. And what they're doing is trying to find ways to see the grandchild every day. The grandchild certainly can't see them in the same way as the note said on a little cell phone. There's no way for us to know what the long-range impact of this is going to be. Having said that, I know that babies are very resilient. kids are very resilient. And as soon as this is lifted and the people can get together and begin hugging each other and being with each other and doing the things that grandparents do, I hope and believe that it will be quickly overcome. But we don't know. These are questions that we just couldn't possibly have an answer to.
I would just add that children of all ages, certainly the littlest ones, are, unless you live in Georgia, are encountering the public and people masked.
True.
So these Zoom and face calls let children know we have faces, we have mouths, we have expressions. With my little kids, we literally count my teeth, which ones have, fillings in them. We play tongue games, like we do all the emotional faces. So, it's, what's that saying, like about exercise? If you can run, don't walk. If you can walk, don't stand. If you can, so if you can FaceTime, don't call. If you can Zoom, don't FaceTime. Like any opportunity that you have to encounter, especially for little kids, let them see all of you. If you're worried that they're just seeing your face, stand back, move your arms, exercise together, use the tools we have to bridge all those things that we're missing without the personal encounter. I know people are talking about writing letters. The permanence of a letter, if this moment is marked by going to a mailbox, kids don't go to mailboxes anymore. Get your grandkids going to mailboxes. They can save keepsakes. I mean, all those Amazon boxes can store something. So you can start to create treasure collections. Like there's a way to kind of spin it. And then the other thing that I would say that I'm learning now from being kind of embedded in my daughter's family here up north, I was focused on all of my issues in relating to the grandkids. I am now stepping back because parents of kids, oh my God. I am missing hugging, I'm missing normal, I'm missing everything that I did before COVID, but I am not responsible for being my grandkids' teacher. I am not responsible for them 24 hours a day. I am not responsible for their socialization. These little kids are, burned out on structured time. I don't know how many of our grandchildren are getting more than a couple hours a week in schooling. They're headed into summer, day camps, sleepaway camps. Our adolescent grandchildren who are robbed of that special summer that they've been gunning for, since summer camp ended last summer. I am trying to also practice putting some of my issues into their own bucket because better I support my daughter and my son in all of their new stresses, marital stresses, financial stresses. It's hard, but one of the ways I grandparent is by trying to not, as much as this whole session is about us, I'm trying to not make my interactions with my adult children about me.
Yeah.
Jill Kay had a lovely comment, and she said, I have a 5-month-old grandson, and I am constantly aware of the time slipping away, but at the same time, it is a great loss to my daughter not having me there. And so I think that certainly speaks to what you're saying. So it's about an hour into the call. I don't know if Marshall, Renee, or Esther, you have any closing thoughts? I want to ask Lee to talk a little bit about a new project we're about to embark on. Before I do that, I love reading the chat comments for lots of reasons, because many of you talked about some of the things that you're doing that are helping. And I encourage you to join our Facebook group, Jewish Grandparents Network Facebook group, and create communities of sharing using the Facebook format. We have a lot to learn from experts, but probably a lot more to learn from each other. So, Lee, you want to talk a little bit about our newest initiative?
Yes, so this dovetails completely with what Marshall has been sharing with us about storytelling, and David and I have been feeling that acutely ourselves, both leading this organization and in our own experience as grandparents, that this is really a potent time for storytelling, and we're going to be launching a feature called Pop-Up Stories. The idea of pop-up stories is that these are not the long autobiographical or biographical narratives that are so daunting for people to often think about, but it's little vignettes. We'll start with those, and it's just the idea about a little story from your life, from your grandparents' life, from your family, that speaks to something that you want to share with your grandchildren, with your family, and they are no longer than 2 paragraphs. 2 paragraphs with a picture, with an item that you want to capture, and then maybe 1 or 2 lessons that are so powerful for you about this particular story and why you're choosing to share it. And we're going to seed it with a number of little pop-up stories, but we would love it if every single person on this call would contribute, because from your questions and your thoughtfulness and your participation, it is so clear that you can all contribute to this, and it would be such a rich resource to be sharing and to be using to encourage, as Marshall says, other grandparents to share their stories and to realize what a gift these are, what a treasure they are, both for ourselves to do the telling and for our families to receive them, and our grandchildren to receive them.
Great.
So that's what I got to say.
So I want to remind everybody that this video has been recorded and it will be available on our website in the days ahead. We're also going to be creating a new page on our website with different videos, including this 3-part series, and a wonderful conversation between Marshall and Ron Wolfson about the power of family stories and other as well. Again, we are going to be sending out an evaluation form. Please fill it out. We do read them all. And your guidance is really important to us as we think about our path forward. With that, I want to thank our panelists who are extraordinary educators, grandparents, and friends. Lee, thank you for your partnership, and thank you everybody for participating. Please be safe out there and continue to be really good grandparents, whether you're grandparents or not. Best regards.
Thank you, everyone.
Wonderful call, David. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.